In July 2019, 20 soldiers from a special Mexican army group were sent into the hills of Guanajuato. Their orders were easy to understand. Find hidden marijuana fields, destroy them, and come back to base. It wasn't their first time doing this. All over Mexico, these small groups of soldiers are used like tools. They search through forests, mountains, and valleys where drug gangs hide their crops. The soldiers knew the dangers. Gang lookouts could be anywhere. Surprise attacks were always possible. Taking a wrong turn in this rocky land could mean never coming back. Still, it was supposed to be a normal mission. They moved quietly, holding their rifles ready, boots crunching on dry dirt. Their radios made crackling sounds, then stopped working as the hills around them grew taller. The forest swallowed sound the way a cave swallows light. Some of the men tried to keep their spirits up. One soldier carried an old photo of his wife and daughter and told the others he'd be home in less than a week. Another joked about the food, calling the beans grenades for the stomach. The laughter was short and nervous. Out here, nerves didn't last long. By nightfall, they had set up camp near a dried-up creek bed. This was normal procedure. They kept their tents low to the ground, marked the area around them, and posted guards who took turns watching. Everything was done correctly. The commanding officer reminded them this was a simple job. In and out, no risky moves, no unnecessary chances. But the land itself seemed to disagree. As the last light faded, the forest turned strangely quiet. No birds, no crickets, not even the rustle of wind in the trees. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. The men settled into their sleeping bags with their rifles close at hand. Then, sometime after midnight, it began. From deep in the forest came the first scream, a long, drawn-out cry that didn't sound like any animal they knew. Some swore it was human, like someone being hurt badly. Others shook their heads. The sound was too low, too deep in the throat, not human at all. The sound stopped, leaving only the pounding of their own hearts. Minutes dragged by, then it came again. Closer this time. The mission was supposed to be about crops, drug gangs, and hidden fields. But by the end of that first night, the soldiers already knew they were not alone. And whatever else lived in those hills had no plan to let them leave quietly. The guards took first watch with red-colored lamps and rifles held low and ready. The radio operator wrote down the time, tried to check in, and got only a hissing sound that turned into silence. He wrote no communication and kept the radio set close. The first scream had cut the night in two. After that, the dark felt crowded, like something stood just beyond the tents, listening. The soldiers on guard duty exchanged quick looks. Their training said, "Hold your position, don't chase noise. Wait for the unknown to step into the light." It didn't. The cry came again, longer, closer, rising until it broke like torn metal. It didn't travel the way sound should. It curved as if pulled by stone. A guard on the north side lifted his hand. Everyone froze. Somewhere past the dry creek, bushes moved once and stopped. No footsteps, no voices, just the feeling of weight in the dark. The commanding officer kept his voice low. "No flashlights unless we make contact. No shots unless fired upon." He moved along the line, a steady beat in a place where time felt strange. Minutes stretched. Breathing got loud. Eyelids burned. Silence returned, thick and fake. A younger soldier counted in his head to keep from shaking. 60, then 120. Then he lost track. The forest gave them nothing but their own heartbeat. At 2:14 the radio coughed, a crackling sound, a clipped word, then a sharp pop like a cable yanked from a socket. The operator turned the dial up and down, found a clear spot in the noise, and lost it again. He didn't write what he felt, that. The interference wasn't from the land. It felt aimed. On the south edge, a guard heard breathing, wet, close to the ground. Not quite animal. He took one step forward, careful not to snap a twig. The breathing stopped. He held still. It started again behind him. He spun around. Gun sight on black. Nothing there. He stepped back into his own footprints and didn't move again. At 3:32, the screams split into more than one voice. Two, maybe three. Not together but calling to each other, answering across the trees with no space between. Human voices carry emotions, begging, panic, hesitation. These carried none. Clean, empty, purpose without feeling. "Hold for light," the officer said. It was the only correct decision on paper, and it turned the hours until dawn into a test. Every sound felt like a trap that would spring if someone breathed wrong. A smell crept in around 3:30. Damp stone, old copper. The medic checked the stove and fuel. Nothing was leaking. The air itself carried it. He tasted metal at the back of his tongue and swallowed it down. The man with the photo slid it out, thumb on the edge, then put it back without looking. A different soldier ran a silent loop of prayers he hadn't used in years. The radio operator tried one more call at 4:47 and got a single word back before the line died again. He wrote down the time with a hand that shook once and stopped. First light came thin and gray. The screams ended like a switch had been thrown. Birds should have started then. They didn't. No insects, no wind through grass. Just the small dry sounds of camp, a zipper, a canteen cap, a throat clearing that made 3 men flinch. Coffee. Eat. "We move in 20, the officer said, voice steady. The rhythm calmed them. They broke camp without talking. Packs up, lines checked, one last look into the trees where the noise had lived. Nothing moved. They walked onto the narrow path. Single file, rifles carried quietly. Boots marked the dust. Radios stayed dead. The forest watched and said nothing. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, they'd already agreed without words. Whatever had cried in the dark was still out there. It hadn't shown itself. It hadn't chased them. It had only told them one thing clearly, patiently, twice. It knew they were here. Morning should have broken the tension, but it didn't. The sun came up pale and thin, light without warmth, painting the hills in gray. The men marched in silence, packs creaking, rifles pointed low. Something was wrong with the forest. Noticing once would have been enough, but every step confirmed it. No bird calls, no wings in the air, no scurrying in the brush. Even the wind seemed absent. The emptiness wasn't a pause in nature, it was absence. The radio operator tried again, thumb pressing the cracked handset. A faint hum came through like a signal trying to break, a promise of contact. The men slowed, waiting, hope rising in their eyes. Then the sound thinned into static and vanished. The operator cursed under his breath and wrote the hour in his log. Nothing more to say. They followed a narrow path that twisted through ridges. Dry leaves snapped under boots but carried no echo. Each sound seemed to fall dead at their feet. A young soldier whispered that the forest was listening. No one corrected him. No one laughed. By midday they found old signs of people passing through. Drug gang trails, faint tracks from mules. But the tracks ended suddenly, as if abandoned or erased. The officer ordered them forward, faster now, eager to finish the search and reach the pickup point. The hills grew jagged, stone pushing out of the soil in broken slabs. The path wound past dark openings in the rock, caves, small and low at first, then larger, yawning black. Some men turned their lights briefly inside. The beams were swallowed after only a few feet. Cool air drifted from the openings, carrying the same metallic smell they had noticed the night before. The officer gave the signal to keep moving. No side trips, no curiosity. But each man felt it. The caves marked the land like scars, and the air around them seemed heavier, colder. The column marched on, boots steady, rifles tight. No one spoke. The caves stayed behind, watching, uncounted. By evening, when they finally set up camp, no one mentioned the silence anymore. It wasn't something to describe, it was something they were inside of, as if the forest itself had chosen not to speak until it was ready. And ahead, though they couldn't see it yet, the largest cave of all waited. By the 3rd day, their luck finally turned. The trail bent through a narrow valley, and there it was. Rows of marijuana plants stretching in neat lines, hidden beneath nets and bushes. Pumps hummed low, feeding plastic hoses that disappeared into the dirt. The officer gave the order and the work began. Machetes cut the stalks. Rucksacks of gear came off shoulders. Small explosives were set in the water system. Within an hour, the crop was nothing but broken stems. By noon, fire rolled across the clearing, black smoke curling into the sky until it disappeared into the higher ridges. The men stood back, rifles slung over shoulders, sweat running down their faces. For the first time in days, shoulders relaxed. The job was done. Couple more days and it's showers and cold beer, one said, kicking at a stump. Another smirked, and no more grenades for the stomach beans. The laughter was short but real this time, a release they had been holding in since the first scream. Still, the officer wasn't about to risk the obvious trail home. Gang lookouts could already be moving. He ordered a different escape route, one less easy to predict, The map showed it going through broken hills and land they didn't know. Safer from surprise attacks, but riskier terrain. By late afternoon they were moving again. The forest closed in around them, paths narrowing into stone gullies. Here and there, cave openings appeared along the slopes. Some were larger than crawl spaces. Others were wide enough to walk through without bending over. The men kept their eyes forward, but they felt the air change when they passed the larger ones. It was cooler there, carrying a trace of moisture, the faint iron scent they all remembered from the night cries, the kind of air that seemed to come from deeper than the earth itself. No one said anything, but each man felt it. The caves weren't just holes in the rock, they were doorways, the kind you didn't cross unless you had to. The unit pressed on, dust rising under their boots, the smell of smoke still clinging to their gear. The plantation was behind them. The caves were waiting ahead. They picked the largest opening and moved in with the skill of men who had learned how to make shelter from rock and shadow. Stone offered 3 walls and a ceiling. It kept wind and sight blocked from 3 directions. In a bad place, a cave is shelter. In a worse place, it's a trap. The officer decided the trade was worth it. Everything that followed was quick and familiar. Men set up low-profile shelters against the stone. Sleeping bags rolled tight. Tripwires with little bells were strung across the narrow entrance. Simple early warning if something pushed through the brush. 2 stacked stones made a short wall near the opening. Nothing fancy, only enough to slow someone long enough to get off a shot. The medic arranged his bag near the wall where the dripping water wouldn't reach. The radio operator climbed a low ledge and checked dials, writing, intermittent. Try every hour. The guard schedule was taped to a rock and marked with a grease pencil. 4 men awake at all times. 2 inside near the entrance. 2 outside watching the approaches. The routine steadied them. It always does. Training turns fear into action. Check the magazines. Cover your area, run the count, and keep shoulders square. For a few hours it worked. Men ate quietly, voices low. Someone tried to joke again, this time. About the heat, but the laugh died fast and was swallowed by the stone. Night settled like a lid. The cave held the sound and made it familiar. The scrape of a zipper, the clink of a canteen, the soft breathing of men who had been taught to wait. Flashlights were kept low. Red lenses over lamps meant less chance of giving away their position. A pair of men took the first watch while the rest tried to sleep in fits and starts. At 3 the guards heard it. It didn't come from the trees this time. It rose from inside the cave, somewhere deeper than the shallow chamber where they had set up. The sound rolled out like a breath dragged across stone, long, broken, and wrong. It bent and echoed off the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Every man was awake in a heartbeat. Rifles slapped into hands. Flashlights snapped to full brightness. The officer's voice cut through the sudden rush of fear. Hold positions, light discipline, report. A man fumbled with his radio and cursed when the dial only hissed and died. The scream came again, closer now. Not traveling from a distance, but erupting from a throat somewhere deeper in the rock. It carried a shape. Not the raw high pitch of a frightened human, nor the thin cry of an animal. It was thick, deep in the throat, and threaded with a note that made teeth ache. The medic squeezed his eyes shut, as if the sound could be stopped that way. The men exchanged looks that needed no words. They were trained to clear spaces, to root out hidden enemies. They were not trained for whatever made that sound. The choices were simple and ugly. Pull up camp and move out blindly through dark hills, risk walking into an ambush or losing men to dangerous ground. Or press inward into the place the noise came from and face whatever lived in the dark head on. Either choice could kill them. The officer made his call quickly. Split the unit. Half hold the entrance, half with me. We clear. The words landed like a blade. Half the men were to form a hard defensive ring, guns braced, lights low, ears open. Their orders were to prevent anything from pouring out while the others went deeper. The other half fitted bayonets, mounted flashlights on rifle rails, and followed the officer into the tunnel. Those who stayed tightened their makeshift wall and crouched behind stones, fingers on triggers, eyes on the black throat of the cave. They listened not only for the scream but for the sound of their brothers, for steps coming back, for a shout, for the familiar rhythm of a comrade's voice. Every sound that was not theirs set their hearts a little higher. The explorers moved like a blade cuts, 2 forward men, 2 covering behind them, light beams cutting narrow cones through the dark. Their boots made little noise on wet stone. Water dripped. The deeper they went, the smaller the world became. No sky, no landmarks, only the arc of light and the rock around it. Breath fogged under their helmets, every shadow seemed to twitch. Inside, the air tasted of old metal and cold. The radio operator's log read a single line later, 3:37. Noise from interior. Split. That was the last thing written before the first cry. It would change everything. Back at the entrance, men waited with the kind of patience that rots your hands. They watched the opening like eyes on a clock, like a countdown you can't stop. The bells on the tripwire tinkled once as a breeze moved through, and no one moved to check the bell. Then, deep inside, the sound rose again, closer, sharper, and this time it carried movement with it. Something answered the light. The deeper they pressed, the less the cave seemed like stone and more like a living throat, swallowing them step by step. The beams of their flashlights swung in narrow arcs, catching water dripping from cracks, the shine of mineral veins, the smooth ribs of rock worn by centuries. Each circle of light faded fast, leaving blackness pressed on every side. The officer moved at the front, rifle high, light steady. Behind him, boots scraped on stone. Each sound grew louder because of the walls until it felt like 100 men moving instead of 8. No one spoke. The air was colder here, carrying the same faint copper smell they had noticed on the second night. It clung to their tongues, made throats dry. At first there was nothing, just echoes of their own movement. The tension almost broke into relief. Maybe it had been nothing, just sounds bouncing off rocks, just the cave itself groaning. But then a beam slid across something that wasn't rock. "Hold!" the officer hissed. The light steadied. It was a patch of greenish, black surface, slick and ridged. The soldier's hand trembled on the flashlight. At first it looked like moss or wet rubber, until the ridges shifted. Scales layered like armor. The shape curved upward, then out, ending in a hand with long clawed fingers that dug into stone. The rest of it pulled free. Eyes caught the light, reflecting it back in a dull, oily shine. They were larger than human eyes, black from edge to edge. No whites, no colored part. The jaw was long, lined with sharp teeth that glistened. The head tilted, studying them with the patience of a hunter. 2 more shapes uncoiled from the walls. They had been there all along, pressed into the stone, impossible to see until they moved. Scaled bodies as tall as men, their limbs bending with strange speed. One hunched low to the ground, claws scraping. Another swung along the wall, climbing sideways as if gravity didn't matter. For a few seconds, both sides stared. Soldiers frozen, creatures waiting. Then one opened its mouth. The scream that poured out wasn't just sound, it was pressure vibrating through chest and teeth, bouncing off the rock until it felt like the whole cave was wailing. Training snapped. The first shot cracked like thunder. Muzzle flash lit the chamber in white bursts. Bullets hammered into scaled chests, heads, limbs. Sparks flew as rounds bounced off, whining into the dark. The creatures barely flinched. One took a round full in the face. It staggered, blinked once, and hissed. The bullet had flattened, sliding off its skin like water. The men fired harder, desperate. Empty bullet casings rattled across the ground. The chamber filled with smoke and flash, but the creatures came anyway. The first soldier to fall was yanked off his feet so fast he barely had time to scream. Claws punched into his shoulder and pulled him into the dark. His rifle clattered against stone. A wet snap followed, then silence. Another tried to hold position. He braced against the wall, fired short bursts, shouted for the others to move. A blur swept in low. The creature's claw raked across his middle, and he folded where he stood. Blood spread fast in the beam of his own flashlight as it dropped to the floor. The officer barked orders, "Fall back! Back now!" But the cave had already become chaos. Light swung wildly, beams catching glimpses of scales, teeth dripping claws. The floor grew slick under boots. Someone screamed a name, then fired blindly into the dark. One of the creatures leaped from the wall, landing so close the impact shook loose dust from the ceiling. Another scuttled across the chamber's upper rim, outlined against their lights, then vanished again. The survivors broke. They ran. Boots pounding wet stone, beams jerking across walls, cutting only glimpses of what chased them. Behind them came the deep roars, so close now it felt like breath on their necks. Another man went down mid-run, tackled into the dark by something too fast to see. His scream ended in a gurgle. No one turned back. The officer kept firing over his shoulder. Short bursts of slow pursuit. Sparks showered each time bullets bounced, but the creatures didn't slow. The cave entrance appeared ahead, a pale slice of moonlight framed by rock. The remaining men poured toward it, lungs burning, ears filled with a pounding echo of their own retreat. They tumbled out into the night, shouting, weapons still raised. The defenders at the entrance sprang forward, dragging them behind cover, gun barrels aimed into the black. But nothing followed. The cave entrance yawned, silent, untouched, as if it had never held anything at all. The soldiers panted, hands shaking, some with blood not their own splashed across their uniforms. They barked half-formed orders, tried the radio again, shouted about what they had seen. And then the screams inside stopped, cut clean, as though a switch had been thrown. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. The men at the entrance stared into the dark hole, rifles steady, sweat running down their temples. The cave gave them nothing back. No eyes, no movement, no sound. Just silence. And somehow that silence was worse. The survivors gathered outside the cave, backs pressed against stone, rifles still trembling in their hands. They shouted over each other. Some begged for air support. Others demanded heavy weapons, anything to erase what they'd just seen. The radio operator worked quickly, cycling through frequencies, tapping, the handset against his palm like it might wake up. For long minutes, nothing but static answered. Then finally, a crackle, a clipped word, and a signal strong enough to push through. Unit Bravo requesting immediate pickup. Multiple casualties. Hostiles. Not human. His voice cracked on the last two words. He didn't repeat them. The officer seized the handset, forced his tone into control, and gave their location. There was no acknowledgement, only silence. But 5 minutes later, the faint thrum of rotor blades rolled across the hills. At first, the men thought relief had come. They looked up, searching the horizon. A helicopter skimmed low over the ridge, black against the moonlight. It had no markings, no national colors, no numbers. It moved quietly, too quietly, with only the heavy chop of blades. Dust and dirt swirled as it dropped into the clearing. The side door slid open, and 4 figures stepped out. They weren't dressed like any unit the soldiers knew. Black armor, seamless and metallic, covered them head to toe. Their visors were smooth plates of glassy black, giving back nothing. Each carried a weapon that hummed faintly, edges sharp and angular. Nothing like the standard rifles of the Mexican army. "Stand down," one of them ordered. The voice was distorted, filtered through a speaker. It was low, mechanical, just human enough to be understood, but not enough to feel natural. The officer demanded identification, unit name, authority. None was given. The order came again, harder. "Stand down." The 4 moved with precision, not glancing at the soldiers, not even noticing their weapons. 2 strode straight into the cave without hesitation. The other 2 remained outside, visor plates reflecting the starlight, standing perfectly still. From inside the cave, the soldiers heard it again. The screams, not as long this time, sharper, more desperate, followed by bursts of weapon fire unlike any sound they knew. Short, surgical, controlled. The noise cut off in seconds. Then came silence. The 2 operatives emerged, dragging between them what should have been impossible. The first body hit the ground with a heavy wet thud, scaled, man-sized, reptilian. The second followed, its chest blown open, black fluid leaking into the dust. Even in death, their jaws hung open, teeth bared, claws curled as if ready to strike again. The soldiers pulled back. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared. Proof lay right there in front of them. Undeniable. One operative stepped closer to the officer. The visor tilted and the distorted voice spoke with mechanical calm. "You saw nothing. You will say nothing. This mission is classified under highest authority." The officer tried to argue, voice cracking with anger, with fear. The operative interrupted. "We know who you are. We know your families. Break silence and you will end yourselves. Do you understand?" The words landed heavy. Not a threat shouted in rage. An instruction delivered like an order. Cold, absolute. No one answered. They didn't have to. The message was clear. The 4 operatives hauled the bodies back to the helicopter. The ramp closed. Dust kicked up, whipping through the soldiers' hair and stinging their eyes. The chopper lifted into the night and vanished without a signal, without a call sign, without a trace. The men stood in the clearing, stunned. The cave yawned behind them, empty again. They had destroyed the plantation. They had followed orders. Yet what they had seen, the things dragged from the dark, the operatives who erased them, would never appear in a report. The night was quiet once more, too quiet, and the soldiers knew the silence wasn't victory, it was control. Back at base, the story was stripped of everything that made it terrifying. The paperwork called it an incident during destruction operations. The language was dry, careful, deliberately thin. Casualties were noted, equipment lost, mission outcome, success. The burned fields were proof enough. Nothing else made it to the file. The soldiers were questioned under fluorescent lights, by men who asked questions with blank expressions and wrote down only what fit inside the lines. Anything outside, the screams, the eyes, the bodies, was met with silence, a pause, and then the suggestion that tiredness can distort memory. The officer pushed once, mentioning what he had seen dragged out of the cave. The man across the table adjusted his glasses and told him that detail was unnecessary. Some of the unit didn't wait for the next order. Within weeks, several quit their jobs, submitting letters with no explanations beyond personal reasons. Others accepted transfers, border duty, city patrols, far-flung outposts. The group that had entered the cave was scattered across the map, broken up like pieces of glass no one wanted put back together. Rumors spread in the mess halls and beyond. One soldier had taken leave and never returned, found later in a motel room with no note. Another turned up in a hospital ward after trying to harm himself. Others were simply said to have checked out, drifting into silence and shadows until their names were replaced by new recruits on the roster. The ones who went home didn't leave it behind either. Families saw it first. A wife told neighbors her husband had started sleeping with the lights on, every room glowing until morning. A mother said her son wouldn't let the windows stay uncovered, curtains pulled tight even in the heat. Children learned quickly not to ask why their father jumped at small noises, why he double-locked doors, why he always carried something in his pocket, even when mowing the lawn. Nightmares followed them like ghosts. One man woke screaming, swearing he heard the same scream rising out of the floorboards. Another dreamed of being dragged backward into the dark, waking only when his wife shook him hard enough to bring him back. Sleep became an enemy, avoided until exhaustion forced it. A researcher named Dana Morera Salazar would later collect pieces of their stories, putting together accounts under strict secrecy. The soldiers spoke carefully, meeting in public places, changing details to hide themselves. They never used their names. Many of them looked over their shoulders more than once during the conversation. They swore they were being watched, sometimes by unmarked cars parked too long on their streets, sometimes by men who didn't order coffee in roadside cafes, sometimes simply by the sense of eyes on them when no one was there. On paper, the mission was a success. Fields destroyed, orders carried out. Another small victory in the endless war against the drug gangs. In life, it was different. The soldiers carried silence instead of medals, fear instead of pride. They were men who had seen too much, ordered to speak of nothing, left with only their shadows for company. And shadows, they learned, can follow you everywhere. What happened in Guanajuato in 2019 may sound like a modern nightmare, soldiers, radios, unmarked helicopters. But the echoes of the story are far older. In Mexico, the idea of creatures that walk half in shadow is not new. The land itself has carried those whispers for centuries. Among the oldest are the nahuales, shapeshifters said to shed their human skin and become animals under cover of night. Some tales paint them as protectors, others as hunters. Farmers spoke of neighbors who could walk the village streets by day, then turn into jaguars or owls when the sun went down. The soldiers' accounts of something moving with strange speed, something that was almost but not quite human, sound disturbingly close to what villagers once whispered about the nahuales, that they were people transformed into something scaled or furred, carrying both the cunning of humans and the strength of beasts. Then there are the serpents of the gods. The Maya called him Kukulkan. The Aztecs called him Quetzalcoatl. Carved into temples and stone reliefs are endless coils of feathered bodies and reptilian jaws. For scholars, they are mythic teachers and sky gods. For those who live closer to the ruins, the carvings look less like imagination and more like memory, a reminder that something serpent-shaped once walked among humans, honored, feared, and hidden behind the mask of a god. The cries heard by the soldiers that first night call back to another story altogether, La Llorona. Across Mexico, parents still warn children not to answer if they hear a woman weeping near water. The legend says she is a mother searching for the children she drowned, cursed to walk riverbanks forever. Her voice is a sign of tragedy, a sound that crawls under the skin. The men in the Guanajuato hills describe screams that seemed female to some, inhuman to others, yet equally sad and eerie. To a soldier raised on stories of La Llorona, the sound of a tortured cry drifting from the darkness would not feel like fantasy. It would feel like proof that the old stories were still alive. And always there are the caves. Across ancient Mexico, caves are more than stone hollows. They are portals. The Olmec, the Maya, the Mexica, all saw them as doorways to the underworld, places where gods emerged and spirits returned. Offerings were left at their mouths and no one entered lightly. Step across the threshold, and you crossed into a world where rules bent and shadows moved on their own. The soldiers didn't just camp in a cave that night. In the language of myth, they trespassed on sacred ground, a portal where other beings had always lived. Even today, in small towns and rural villages, people warn children not to follow strange cries into caves, not to answer voices that seem to call from underground. The reason is never stated as aliens or monsters. It is older and simpler. Things live there that are not meant for us. So when the 20 soldiers heard screams in the night and later saw shapes in the dark, their story did not fall on empty ears. It slotted into a framework. Already waiting, centuries of tales about beings that are part human, part serpent, part shadow. Maybe what they faced in Guanajuato was new. Maybe it came from somewhere beyond the stars. Or maybe it was something that had always been here, hiding in hills and caves, remembered only in legend, and whispered to children before sleep. One truth remains. The fear the soldiers carried is the same fear that echoes through Mexico's folklore. A cry in the night that doesn't sound human. A figure in the dark that moves like no man should. A cave that feels less like shelter and more like a doorway. The mission is over. The paperwork is filed. But the echoes remain, tying the soldiers' silence to legends that stretch back hundreds of years. Guanajuato was not the first place to hear those cries, and it will not be the last. Once a story like this goes out into the world, it rarely stays alone. People remember things that don't fit, they tell them, and those small confessions add up into a pattern. Guanajuato is one point on a map. There are others. Guanajuato, California Highway, 2016 EFIR. A man we'll call John was driving south on I-5 one evening when his passenger shouted and pointed. On the shoulder, standing under the hard glare of a roadside reflector, was a figure like nothing he expected. Tall, wrapped in a heavy black robe despite the heat. Hood pulled up. As they drove past, John says he got a clear look at the face beneath the hood. Not a human face, but a flattened snout, greenish scales, and big dark eyes that caught the light. The three in the car all agreed on what they'd seen. John later filed a civilian report. When investigators followed up, they judged him honest. He told them he regretted not turning back for a photo. The image stayed with him. It's a small, plain testimony. A driver, a roadside figure, a face that did not belong to any animal he knew. Essex, United Kingdom, backyard, late night Wes. A different kind of sighting came from a garden in Essex. A man stepped outside to put out trash and froze. Up in a tree, something tall watched him. It was taller than a man, upright, and its skin looked like thick reptile hide. When he stared, the creature did something that made his blood run cold. It shifted color, matching the leaves and branches, until it seemed to vanish. He backed away slowly and left his yard that night. A decade earlier in Somerset, a woman named Margaret reported a brief encounter with a small blue-tinged figure clinging to an oak. She felt a wordless exchange, curiosity and embarrassment more than hate, and left it at that. Both accounts share a detail that matters. The beings can hide in plain sight, change color, step out, and then step away. Gavi Yucatan, Mayan elder, 1957. Longer ago, in 1957, a Mayan boy named Chaktuk told a different sort of story. He and others saw a bright ball of light drop into the jungle. They went searching and found not a crash site, but two red eyes glowing above them in the trees. The thing that leaped down was described as large, powerful, and frog-like in its skin. After that night, the searchers fell ill for weeks with fever and rashes, a physical toll that turned the sighting into something more than a strange memory. Whether that sickness was coincidence or result is debated. The memory stays in local oral records. Elders still tell it as a warning. Oh, what the small echoes share. Look at those 3 reports side by side, and certain lines stand out. Witnesses talk about silence around the sighting, an absence of birds or insects, a hush that feels deliberate. Several describe a smell, damp stone, metal, something like old copper. The beings often appear without clear approach. One moment nothing, the next a figure standing in the open. They'd vanish just as oddly, a color shift, a slide into shadows, a leap and gone. And when the encounter is close and physical, witnesses sometimes report sudden illness or long-lasting nightmares. None of these accounts proves the Guanajuato story. None of them belongs to the same night or the same place, but together they sketch a shape. Scattered reports from different cultures and climates that echo one another in small but important ways. Roadside robes in California, color-shifting figures in Essex, red eyes in a Mayan jungle, separate points that suggest a wider pattern, so the map widens. Guanajuato stops being the single strange dot and becomes part of a larger unsettling pattern. If these accounts are honest, and most of the witnesses interviewed by researchers came across as steady and unwilling to exaggerate, then whatever the soldiers found in that cave might not be unique. The question grows, how many places carry that hush, that smell, that vanishing act? How many small, quiet moments are waiting for someone to notice? And if Guanajuato is only one echo, where does the sound come from? Bravery has many faces. Some of it lives in medals and reports, the kind that gets read aloud at ceremonies. But another kind never leaves the shadows where no one applauds and nothing is written down. That is the kind the survivors carried home. One man sat at a metal desk in his barracks with a scrap of paper and a photo of his daughter propped against his rifle butt. He began a letter he never intended to send. He told her the mountains had voices, that if she ever heard a cry in the night that made her bones ache, she should not answer it. He folded the paper, slid it into an envelope, and tucked it into the back of his vest. It stayed there like a hidden wound, carried through each assignment until the edges curled and the ink blurred with sweat. Another soldier never wrote a word. His ritual was prayer, though he no longer believed much in God. Every night lying in his bunk he counted breaths. 4 in, hold, 4 out, hold. On the 5th he pictured the cave closing like a door. On the 6th he begged for silence, not with words but with a desperate weight of thought. When sleep finally came, it came like a fall. A third man built habits he never explained. He stacked books against the latch of his bedroom window. He left the bathroom light on every night, though he told his wife it was for the children. He checked the locks 3 times before lying down, then checked them again when the house was quiet and she was asleep. Nightmares were common ground. Men woke choking on screams, swearing they'd heard claws on stone or a scream inside the walls. One dreamed of being pulled backward into the dark, waking only when his bunkmate shook him hard enough to break the spell. Another swore he still smelled copper and damp stone whenever it rained. Fear settled in as quietly as dust. Rear-view mirrors got checked twice, then 3 times. A van parked too long on the street made a man stay awake all night, hand near a pistol he wasn't supposed to keep at home. Conversation stopped when a stranger sat too close in a cafe. The sense of being watched never left, and in some ways they were. The monsters had been real. That much was certain. But what followed was worse. Because the creatures had claws and teeth, the silence had no shape at all, and still, it hollowed them out more completely than anything they faced in that cave. Caves are thresholds. They look like empty rooms, carved by water. But they behave like doors. Step across and the world's rules loosen. Sound bends, air grows old, time stretches. Jungles do their own listening, leaves hide things. Silence is not absence. It's attention. The soldiers in Guanajuato walked through both leaf and stone, path and mouth. They went in to burn fields and came out carrying questions no report could hold. The cave gave them a lesson their training never covered. Sometimes the threat isn't on the map, sometimes it lives beneath it. And if it happened there, why only there? Mexico is full of openings, grottos, cenotes, old mines punched into the hills. Some are mapped, most are not. Across the world, forests and rock do the same quiet work. They keep secrets, they wait, they choose their witnesses. So the question lingers like a draft from an unseen tunnel deep underground. What else is waiting? Is the hush you feel on a night hike just weather? Or is it a held breath? Are those echoes only yours? Or is something answering back from a place your light can't reach? The men who went inside can't tell you, or won't. Their silence is paperwork and pressure, a lid fitted tight. But stories find cracks, they leak, they collect in corners until someone finally says, listen, if you were at that cave entrance, if the screams lifted out of the dark and pulled at your bones, what would you do? Go in with the team or stay outside and hold the line? Tell me in the comments. I want to know which choice you'd make when the rules blur and the dark starts to speak. If this story stayed with you, if it made you recheck a shadow or listen harder to a quiet field, stay with us, subscribe. There are more field reports, more testimonies, more places where the earth opens and something old looks back. Stories like this aren't finished. They keep walking beside the road, standing at the tree line, breathing under the stone. We'll follow, carefully, with the light we have.